Hello and welcome to the GCSE English Language Revision Guide for Paper 1, Question 2. Here's an example, Question 2 from an actual exam paper. Most of you will have seen one like this before. As you can see, the question tells you which part of the text to focus on and they give you the extract to work from. You'll also see that the question tells you the specific aspect of the extract you should focus on. In this case, the writer's description of the storm. And here, the exam board gives you some prompts about the things you could include in your answer. So, how do you answer the question? Firstly, you need to identify language features the writer has used in a specific part of the text and explain the effects the language creates. You need to quote evidence from the text. You also need to use the subject terminology related to language features. You must write your answer using point, evidence, explain paragraphs. And you should aim to write about a page and a half. The exam board advised you to spend no more than 10 minutes on this question, 12 minutes if you get 25% extra time. The question is worth 8 marks. So, when it comes to the subject terminology you need to answer question 2 in the Paper 1 exam, there's quite a bit you need to know. For example, when writing about the words and phrases the writer uses, you need to use the following subject terms: adjective, noun, noun phrase, verb, and adverb. And when writing about the other language features and imagery techniques, you need to use these subject terms: simile, metaphor, personification, symbol, onomatopoeia, and alliteration. Now, as you'll see later in the guide, you don't need to write about every single one of these in your answer, but you do need to cover a range. So, here's a little pro tip for you about the subject terminology related to this question. As you can see, the bullet points in the question also suggest you could write about sentence forms. However, this is only a suggestion. You do not have to write about sentences. Even the exam board advised it's better to focus on 4 or 5 word classes and imagery techniques. For example, you might write about 2 adjectives, a verb, and a simile. Now, here's the assessment objective you need to achieve for question 2. Students must explain, comment on, and analyse how writers use language to achieve effects that influence readers, using relevant subject terminology to support their views. The mark scheme for this question is broken down into 4 levels. There's level 4, where student responses are detailed and perceptive, and will be awarded 7 to 8 marks. And this roughly equates to students achieving grades 7 to 9. Then there's level 3, where responses are clear and relevant, and where students are awarded 5 to 6 marks. And this is the level that most of you are aiming to achieve this summer. Then there's level 2, where students demonstrate some understanding, and here students are awarded 3 to 4 marks. And this roughly equates to grades 3 and the bottom of grade 4. Finally, there's level 1, where student responses are simple and limited, and here only 1 or 2 marks are awarded. And this relates to grades 1 to 2. To successfully answer question 2 on the Paper 1 exam, the mark scheme states that you must do 3 things. Firstly, you must explain the effects of the writer's choices of language. And this really means that you must explain the effects of the language clearly and in detail. Secondly, you must select a range of relevant textual detail. And this means that you must quote evidence from the text to support each point you're making. Thirdly, you must make clear and accurate use of subject terminology. And this means you must use the subject terms and use them correctly. Now, let's take a look at an example question 2 answer. This student was awarded 4 marks, placing them on the boundary of grades 3 and 4. Take a moment to read the response and then watch and listen to the commentary that follows. So, as you can see from the blue highlights, the student has clearly quoted evidence from the text. Although here, here, and here they have begun their sentences with a piece of evidence rather than a clear point, and this is something you should avoid doing in the exam. Now looking at the orange highlights, you can see that the student has used some subject terms. Personification, which is an example of an imagery technique, but here they've used a very simple and vague term and one that has been spelt incorrectly. Looking at the purple highlights now, we can look at the student's attempts at explaining the effects of the language. The student isn't wrong here, but these are very brief comments rather than detailed explanations that show a clear understanding of the effects the writer has created. And here, in the last paragraph, the student's attempted explanation isn't clearly related to the language feature they've quoted. Tangled is a verb that means caught up or trapped in something. It's not related to forgetting, so no marks have been awarded here. So, let's recap the 4-mark example answer. What did the student do well? Firstly, they quoted some evidence from the text. Secondly, they used some subject terminology. And thirdly, they made an attempt to explain the effects of the language features. However, the response only received 4 marks. So, what did the student fail to do? The evidence was not always clearly related to the explanations. They lacked a range of subject terms. And they only made brief comments rather than clear and detailed explanations. Now, let's take a look at an example response that was awarded 5 marks, placing the student around the grade 4 level. Take a moment to read the response and then watch and listen to the commentary that follows. So, with the blue highlights, you can see that the student has clearly quoted evidence from the text, and unlike the 4-mark answer you've just seen, this student uses point evidence explained perfectly to structure their paragraphs. Now, with the orange highlights, you can see the student using some appropriate subject terms. However, they haven't used a range of subject terms. For example, here, here, and here, the student has made the error of using simple terms instead of the specific word classes. Moving on to the student's explanations, you can see that they clearly explain the effects by developing their response in much more detail. Instead of 3-line paragraphs like the 4-mark response, this student's paragraphs are 5 and 6 lines long. Now, for those of you who want to achieve a grade 5 or 6 in this summer's exams, with a few simple improvements, this is the type of answer you should be aiming for. So, let's recap the 5-mark response. What did the student do well? Firstly, they used some subject terminology. Secondly, their explanations were clear and more detailed than the 4-mark answer. Thirdly, they used clear, relevant quotes as evidence. However, the student only received 5 marks. So what did the student fail to do? Crucially, they lacked a range of subject terms. This is because they labelled some of the examples of language use as words or word rather than adjectives and verb. If they had used the specific word class terminology, this would have been awarded 6 marks and placed the student at the level of grades 5 and 6. So, let's take a look at an example of a 7-mark answer, which places the student in the area of the higher grades 7 to 9. Take a moment to read the response and then watch and listen to the commentary that follows. So, with the blue highlights, you can see that the student has clearly quoted a range of relevant evidence to support their answer. And, like the 5-mark response, the student has used point evidence explained perfectly. Now, with the orange highlights, you can see that the student has used a range of specific subject terms, including a higher level sophisticated terminology here and here. So the student has got 4 individual language features: verb, personification, adjectives, and another verb. With the purple highlights, you can also see that the student's explanations of the effects of the writer's language are also clearly explained in detail, although the last paragraph isn't developed as consistently as the other two, which would indicate why the student was awarded 7 out of 8 marks rather than 8 out of 8. So, if you're trying to push yourself to achieve a grade 7 or above for your GCSE English, the level of explanation seen here in this response is the level you need to achieve. So, let's recap the 7-mark response. What did the student do well? They used clear, relevant quotes. They used sophisticated subject terminology, and they analysed a range of language features. They also wrote perceptive and detailed explanations that showed a deep understanding of the effects. So, what did the student fail to do? Well, it's a bit harsh perhaps. The last explanation in the answer wasn't as detailed as the other two. Therefore, the student was awarded 7 out of 8 rather than 8 out of 8. So, when it comes to answering question 2 on the paper 1 exam, there's a few things you need to remember. Always explain the effects of the language clearly and in detail. Always quote evidence from the text to support each point you're making. Make sure you use a range of subject terminology. And always use the specific subject terms. And remember, you need to spend around 10 minutes answering this question, or 12 minutes if you get 25% extra time. Well, that's it for question 2. If you have any questions or if there's anything you're still not sure about, speak to your teacher and they'll be able to help you out. You'll find more of these videos and interactive revision guides for each question on Moodle. You'll also find lots of past exam papers. So, why not check one out and get practicing?